You're listening to the Global Ed Podcast, where educators share inspiring and thought-provoking stories from around the world.
In this episode, I'll be speaking to Lynn, a member of the Shoshone-Paiute tribe in Nevada, USA, and a Native American educator. Lynn, welcome to the Global Ed Podcast. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hauma, ne Lynn Manning minania, ne Dokabari Waite, ne Tenichueda Owaihi Combined School, ne Nawamagotni. Hi, Gavin. My name is Lynn Manning John. I am the principal of Owaihi Combined School located on the Duck Valley Indian Reservation. I am Shoshone-Paiute and leading a school that serves the Shoshone-Paiute people.
It was wonderful to hear you speaking in the native language during your introduction. Could you tell me a bit more about your background and the connection to the community that you live in, please?
I am a tribal member here of the Duck Valley Shoshone-Paiute tribes, and I am also a graduate of the school where I am now the principal. This community is predominantly Shoshone-Paiute, so for somebody to come out of this community and return to it as the lead is not unheard of, but it isn't necessarily common. I've now been here for 11 years, and this is my first as the principal. So it's been really wonderful returning to my home, returning to my community, and serving the children that will soon be the leaders of our tribe.
Before other peoples came, they shared this land. Before maps divided the lands and policies confined First Nations to the reservations, the Shoshone and Paiute peoples shared the resources that became the tri-state area of Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada.
So I am Shoshone and Paiute. Both of my parents are also Shoshone-Paiute. I do have other tribal ancestry, including Chippewa and Cree, as well as Hopi, and also a variety of other mixed ancestry going back to colonization. But my predominant identity is Shoshone-Paiute, and that is my citizenship, the Duck Valley Shoshone-Paiute tribe.
I noticed there that when you talked about your identity, you described your citizenship as being Shoshone-Paiute. Why do you describe it in those terms?
Yes. So tribes predate colonization, and our identity and belonging to those tribal nations precedes that of the United States. So over time, my ancestors leading up to me and carrying on through my children have maintained a political identity with our tribal nation. The Shoshone and Paiute people are our sister tribes, and we shared the area that is now Nevada and Idaho. Geographically, it's called the Great Basin, and this area is where we come from. Our creation stories put us here at the beginning of time.
You mentioned that the reservation is located in Nevada and Idaho within the Great Basin region. Is it set in an urban area or is it out in the countryside somewhere?
So, the Duck Valley Indian Reservation is one of the most isolated areas within the continental United States as measured by relative distance to the nearest interstate. So we are 100 miles to the north of the Elko, Nevada interstate and 100 miles to the south of the Bruno, Idaho interstate. So coming here takes an effort. And it has both served us and also been a barrier in some ways.
So how many people live on the reservation?
There are about 1,200 people who reside here, the majority of which are Shoshone-Paiute, although we do have people of other ethnicities and backgrounds who also reside here.
You mentioned that the reservation is quite far from anywhere. So could you describe to me what the local area and community are like, please?
We are a community made up of families and extended families that spread across a high mountain valley. So originally, this land used by both the Shoshone and Paiute people was an area that had everything that our people needed to survive. There are mountains in which there are deer, elk, and antelope. There are roots and berries, which were our subsistence foods historically and in modern times. We use medicines that we gather. But with the introduction of colonization, we had cattle ranching introduced. So we also have cattle ranches with cows and horses. We do have some families that have broadened their ranching into other types of animals, sheep and goats and such. But not every family is a ranching family. Most people who reside here are either unemployed or are employed by our tribal government or by the school. Those are the two primary employers. But looking across our valley, we are in a high desert. We have sagebrush, willows. We have a river that runs through. We have several reservoirs located within the reservation that we use for fishing and recreation. We have the most beautiful sunrises and sunsets. And we believe that we have the best water on earth, which is drawn straight from the mountain.
It sounds like a beautiful place for your community to live. Previously, you mentioned colonialization. Could you give me a bit of history of the tribe and what the impact of colonialization has been on its way of life?
As the people of this land, we were migratory. Sometimes that is referred to as nomadic, but we knew where we were going, and we knew where we were going to cycle back to, dependent upon the time of year. When colonization occurred, it did not directly impact us for about 300 years until the United States became an independent country and westward expansion occurred. So while all of the things regarding George Washington and such were happening in Washington, D.C. and New York City, we were continuing to live here in our traditional ways, unaffected by those events. So we did not have contact until the early 1800s. And at that time, again, the interactions were brief and they weren't hostile. And it wasn't until our lands and people became inundated that conflicts began to occur. And a lot of it had to do with resources. This land in particular does not have an abundance of resources. So as colonizers came across, they were looking for water, they were looking for food, they were bringing cattle and horses across, and all of us were competing for the same resources. And that created conflict. On the Shoshone side, which is now on the Nevada side, it was the discovery of gold that really drove conflict. The Shoshone people thought that they were agreeing to a treaty of peace and friendship and passage when the United States presented the Treaty of Ruby Valley. But what the Treaty of Ruby Valley really did was, in a fail swoop, allow for settlement without compensation. So up until the modern century, the Shoshone people have not been compensated for the gradual encroachment of what is now the state of Nevada.
What was the traditional approach to education, and what impact did colonialization have on the young people of the tribe?
So for Shoshone and Paiute people, we did not have formalized education prior to colonization. Children were brought up in their bands and most often had gender roles. So young girls were taught the ways of women by women, and young men were taught the ways of men by men, but it was by observation and mentoring and practice. So it wasn't until colonization, and again, for us that occurred in more recent times, the United States government had adopted a policy based upon the ideas of a General Richard Pratt, who's most well known for the phrase, "kill the Indian to save the man." And it was his idea to remove children, Native children, from their families and communities, put them into military type of education systems, wherein the children would have their hair cut, be given American names, forced to speak English and adopt Christianity. So over a period of 100 or so years, children were systematically removed from tribal communities and placed into this boarding school system, where they were not treated kindly or with love, and many children perished in this system. We don't know how many children were lost, but we do know that every boarding school located across the United States has an associated graveyard.
You mentioned a phrase, kill the Indian to save the man. What does that mean?
Richard Pratt was, I believe, a general in the United States Army. And he came up with this idea that Native people, who are at the time a nuisance and a barrier to westward expansion and the establishment of the United States, it was his idea that you could save the human if you removed their nativeness. And it was his phrase, kill the Indian, save the man, that was the motto that carried the boarding school movement. That there was a human inside this being that if you removed their native identity, they could be saved.
What was the impact of that philosophy, that way of thinking on the education system and the young people within it?
It was terrible. It was absolutely traumatic. The children who were removed from these communities and placed in these spaces were stripped of their humanity. They had their hair cut, their names changed. They were forced to wear clothing. They were indoctrinated into believing that the people and family and lifeways and homelands that they loved were wrong and bad. And that cognitive dissonance that occurred for those that survived resulted in generations of alcoholism, depression, self-harm, post-traumatic stress disorder, and leading up to the modern day historical trauma that we as modern day Native people continue to struggle with. How that is reflected in the modern day school system is that we continue to have elders and even parents who may even just be in their 20s and 30s who do not see the importance of education in a modern context because they see it as an attempt, a continued attempt, to remove a child's identity.
So where do you start when looking to heal these historical traumas and the impact that they've had on generations of people?
There is an effort nationally, both in the United States and in Canada, to talk about truth and reconciliation when it comes to the history of boarding schools. We have people who don't want to talk about it. They're still traumatized by that experience, and they aren't ready to talk. At the same time, they are willing to be seen as a survivor. So we are still in that space of reconciliation. And I think before we can address those individuals, we have to make sure we're doing it in a way that recognizes their trauma and ensures that they will be safe and not judged for the experiences that were inflicted upon them. They were children. And we're doing what we can to educate our youth today to let them know that the position we are in is no fault of theirs, but is a product of governmental policy. And making them aware of their own history is eye-opening, often traumatic, but one in our space is a shared history.
And how does that history continue to shape the community?
The children who survived this system either integrated into the general population, which was the design, or they did return to their tribal communities where they struggled with that duality. Am I a Native person anymore? Or am I an American? And not being raised in love or nurtured as they were traditionally began abusive behaviors, and alcohol became part of the ways that people coped. When those individuals had children, those children were also then placed into the boarding school system. So this became intergenerational, leading up to modern times where every Native person alive today is a descendant of a survivor of that system. And it wasn't until about the 1980s that this system stopped.
As a tribal member affected by this history, and now as the principal of the local school, have you found it a struggle to reconcile these two positions that you hold?
It's been a struggle within my community to change that perspective. And it is my position as a Shoshone-Paiute person who loved learning as a child, who loved reading, but who was also criticized by my peers for that, to now lead a school and say, hey, we can be both and. We can be Native, fully Native, not have to shed that identity at the schoolhouse doors, come here and be successful and high achieving as Native people, and not have to live in conflict with ourselves. Are we going to be Native or are we going to be educated? We can and must be both and, but it continues to be a struggle, even in modern times.
So has there been any changes to the education system to make sure that what happened in the past isn't repeated, or any efforts made to recognise the importance of Native American culture within schools?
On the Duck Valley Indian Reservation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is the governmental entity within the United States that oversees the caretaking of Indigenous people. We are considered wards of the United States, but we are heirs to this land and heirs to all of the royalties, as it were, which for us, the only royalty we really want is our sovereignty and the ability to exert our own powers over our own people. But that is not the case when you are a ward. So the United States government, Bureau of Indian Affairs, placed a school on the Duck Valley Indian Reservation to educate the kids here so that they would not have to be removed and placed in boarding schools. That school is the school that I work in. It is no longer overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It is now overseen by the Elko County School District. It is a public school operated by the state of Nevada, but it's still the same building. And so there's a lot of things that have happened in this building over time. English only, consequences for Native children speaking our tribal languages, children not being permitted to practice our Native culture, languages, and traditions within the school walls. All of that was disallowed. Fast forward to modern times. In January of 2023, the Elko County School District changed their policy to allow our tribal people to speak our tribal languages in our school. That was a year and a half ago. So everything is still shifting towards allowing us to be full people and fully seen and fully self-actualized in our own space. So all of that results in our modern day school system, which while historically did not allow those things, in modern times, that is part of our school performance plan. Now we're bringing our elders in and having our elders teach our children things that would have historically been taught in the home since birth. We're having to reintroduce children to that so that they have that, so that they can carry it into the future. We're at a real critical time where if we don't, it'll be lost to audio and visual recordings. But we still have people who are fluent speakers of our tribal languages. We still have people who are language keepers and knowledge holders and know our plant medicines and know our traditional life ways.
So how do you bring traditional teachings and native wisdom into the modern day classroom?
So our native teachers are especially adept at introducing themes that are relevant to us while they're talking about about whatever their content area is. So for example, in our U.S. history class, while students are learning about the Constitution and really may not be engaged with the content, our social studies teacher will talk about what we were doing at that same time, how it impacted Native people at that time, what we were doing here, and how it impacts us today, making it relevant for kids. But that's a very unique aspect that takes place in our building that probably doesn't take place elsewhere. Our English teacher teaches Gothic literature. So while she's teaching about Frankenstein, she can also ask students to explore our Nunnet stories, our monster stories, and do a compare and contrast so that they don't become totally disengaged with Frankenstein, which, while that is one of my favorite books, isn't necessarily enticing to a 14-year-old. But if we can do a compare contrast, they can learn both and. So we do have staff who are really experts in their field when it comes to introducing Native content on top of the state standards. But we want to make sure that our children and staff and community knows that we want kids to show up fully as themselves. So on our heritage days, students can honestly wear traditional clothing every day if they wanted to, but we are intentional about making sure students know they can wear the clothing that represents their heritage. And so we set aside days or we promote days where we want as many kids as we can to participate in this, whether it be through beadwork or quill work, or even just things that show our tribal seal, that we are proud to be Native and we are fully Native in this space.
Given the traumatic history of the school system towards Native Americans, what is the current narrative within the school to help support and encourage the students?
I try to impart on every student here how important they are. Not one of them is expendable. Every single one of them matters. And I believe that every single one of them knows that I feel that way about them. And I believe that's where it starts. My staff and our community members absolutely love and support our school, our student, our athletic teams. We have a lot of successes here. We have a lot of resiliency. It doesn't always show in our test scores. But again, that is not how we measure our worth. We measure our worth in how we take care of each other and how we help each other and how we push forward as individuals and as families, as a community, and as a tribe.
How do you and your staff hope that this school will now impact the lives of the current generation and the generations to come?
I stand firmly on the belief that the future of my tribe is in this building, and the way we are going to continue into the future is through education. It has been second nature to me to speak our native language that our students still hold to and with the students on a daily basis. And it may be something small. It may be a greeting. It may be asking them about their mu'a, which is their mother's mother, or asking them about whether or not they saw a nunut, which is our word for like a monster or the boogeyman, and just integrating language throughout the day. Because one of the things that I try to live is that I am these children. Their background is my background. So becoming as authentically me, I think, has been helpful. It's using my connections, family connections, and humility, and approaching my elders and asking them to come help us.
Now, I know that after a lot of community effort, there is some big news about the future of the school. So can you share it with us, please?
In cooperation with the tribal government, we were able to successfully lobby for $64.5 million from the state of Nevada to build a new school. So in the coming years, we should have a brand new building. This building, with all of its trauma, will be left behind. And we will be looking at a new space that fully integrates Shoshone and Paiute language as well as English, that has spaces that embrace the full child, that walking in the door, every person will know that we are proud Shoshone-Paiute people who are forward-looking and looking to achieve in ways that we can continue to thrive into the future.
Wow, that's amazing. Congratulations to you and the tribal government and all of your community on getting the funds for the new school. I'm sure that being free of the trauma of the old school and having a purpose-designed school for the needs of your community will be a significant moment for your nation. As you consider the new school, what would success look like for your students?
Really, I would like for my students to become productive members of our tribal community. That means being able to be thinkers, to be able to think, read, write, communicate, maintain a household, positively parent, engage in tough conversations about our history within themselves and with their children when they have them. I need for every child in my school who will soon grow into an adult to take upon themselves the responsibility to fight for us.
As we finish our time together, what is your message for the young Shoshone-Paiute students who will walk through the gates of the school?
Ye Shitina Tami Gubata, our Creator up above over all of us. Yao Tami Samaa Ekyama Natinachui Mamakwasi. We are gathered for the completion of education. Tami Yeshi Bishao Sosokwama Una Amuhu Sukwahai. We are happy and very proud. Tami Ama Zumayuna Yeshi Bishao Ukaumu Mayahuku. We think about our ancestors and push forward with what we are learning. Yukwaya Uma Kimasi Musukwai Watniku Suhani Borona. We have come far, and now we have to think about the things that we want. Kwaya'a Mukwitso Aina Suhani Borona, for a good life into the future. Yeshi Utu Denana Noa Dewatsaiko. This is how we will be helping our families and our people. Otno Hino Yona Bijatsi Manipane Doasa'a. All things will be good in that way. Nana Nobikwaite Kwaya'a Doshobisha Manipani Duaku. All of the families will do good for a long time. Bisha Sa'a Kwitsoi Naro Sa'a. Their life and well-being will be good. Pua.
Lynn, thank you so much for sharing your story and that of your tribe on the Global Ed podcast.
Next time on the Global Ed podcast.
George Jackson Academy is a special place. We work with boys from all over New York City, and we focus on low-wealth families. And so our families are people of color. So Black, African descent, Latino, Hispanic, Asian, South Asian. And I want our boys to be connected to the communities of which they're part and to be connected to each other so that they're engaging with society, that they're engaging with life in meaningful and positive ways.
In the next episode, we travel from Nevada to New York and meet Ramon. Ramon runs a school on the east side of Manhattan, and he shares how his school operates and provides life-changing opportunities for its students. If you have enjoyed listening to the Global Ed podcast, please subscribe and follow me, Gavin Kinch, on LinkedIn.